Welcome, everybody, to the Halifax Security Forum. My name is Evan Solomon. I am now the publisher of G0 Media, which is a subsidiary company of the Eurasia Group. I'm also on the senior management committee there, and I'm a special correspondent now with CTV, which is very recent. I am delighted to be here for this conversation on the disinformation nation, kidnapping our citizens, corrupting our officials, and stealing our stuff, which is about as colloquial as you can get for some very serious issues. We have a remarkable panel for the next hour. We will take questions, and I hope it's a lively debate. I think the senator said, avoid being turgid, and he used the word turgidity.
I made that up.
Yeah, it was good. And that could be our first form of new information. Let me introduce our panel, and then we'll get into, I think, a fascinating matter. I will start with Senator Chris Coons, the senator from Delaware, who serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee and chairs the Ethics Committee on Senate. He's also on the Judiciary Committee on Privacy, Technology, and Law. He's very involved in this, so it's a pleasure to welcome the senator here. I want to then introduce Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. You will know Svetlana very well as the leader, national leader of Belarus, widely seen probably by everyone in this room as the winner of the elections in Belarus against Lukashenko. She had to leave the country. Her husband has been imprisoned and brutally tortured there. She's a two-time Nobel Prize nominee. And it is an absolute pleasure to have you here in the country and here. I want to also introduce Ms. Yasmin Green. She's the CEO of Jigsaw. I don't know, I'm sure most of you know Jigsaw is a division within Google that addresses threats to open societies. They publish lots of remarkable work, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Yasmin has to say. I also then want to introduce you to Yevhen Fedchenko, who's the editor-in-chief of Stop Fake Ukraine. They are combating disinformation. If you think you're busy, you're not compared to what Yevhen has to handle. The amount of disinformation is a deadly tsunami. And then, of course, I am delighted as well to introduce Andrew Shearer, the Director General of the Office of National Intelligence in Australia, and of course, facing multiple threats, much like the Canadian context, whether it's from China or other national governments or other malevolent forces. So a pleasure to have you here. We're going to do quick opening statements, and then we'll get a series of questions, and then, of course, we'll get to the questions. But given the situation, Svetlana, I want to start with you. Obviously, the situation in Belarus, people are deeply concerned not only about how Putin is trying to potentially open up another front there, but talk about the disinformation and the repression that Lukashenko and how he's doing that inside Belarus, and what kind of information are citizens getting? How are they combating that?
So first of all, I have to say that Lukashenko's regime is built on lie. For many, many years, using state TV, state newspapers, they wanted to assure Belarusians that they are living in a wonderful country, like island of stability, that Western countries are rotten, that but Belarusians living with wonderful life. But when new opportunities with the help of internet, with the opportunity to travel, visas were opened for Belarusians, young generation get opportunity to visit our countries, to see how in reality other people live. They started ask questions to themselves, first of all. Do we really live in a wonderful country? Our relationship with the Russian Federation are so profitable for Belarus, and Lukashenko couldn't stop this development of the situation. And all this burst into huge uprising in 2020 after fraudulent elections. And what Lukashenko did at that moment, he just blocked internet for a couple of days. For people didn't have opportunity to communicate, to coordinate their actions. And the only opportunity for them to communicate at that moment was TikTok. So people tried to use every possible opportunity to communicate. Then when people's uprising was going on and Lukashenko understood that it's not just usual uprising that took place in previous years, he started to block alternative media in our country. And he declared all the media as extremists and like forbade people to read, to watch YouTube, you know, to read alternative media. And media had to flee Belarus. They relocated the media in exile and started to work from there. So now Lukashenko, when you are in Belarus, and for example, when you are kidnapped and KGB people see that you are subscribed to one channel, you know, to Telegram, to alternative media, it's like real way to prison. You will be detained for many, many years just for comment, for tweet, for like in any platforms. So, but people are studying. They know how to circumvent the restrictions. We are using VPNs. You know, people have to delete the history of their searches and so on. But it's a huge stress for people. But through you know, propaganda means are still in Belarus. They're using TV, newspapers, you know, to send like wrong messages to people. So now, for example, when Belarus was dragged into this war, when Lukashenko became accomplice to Putin in the war against Ukraine, Lukashenko, to justify his actions, he says that Ukrainians are our enemies, Ukrainians want to bomb us, that Tikhanovskaya and all the democratic movement is follow Nazism, Nazi values and so on. And our task now is to counter this propaganda. It's very important. It's like sometimes for us it seems that informational war is even more important than war on the ground, because we don't need HIMARS, for example, as Ukrainians do, and we fully support these demands, requests. All the attention has to be paid to Ukraine now, but we need more assistance in informational space.
Okay, and we'll get to that. Just when you say the shutdown on the internet in Belarus, I think the stat is since 2016, according to Access Now, about 225 occurrences of repressive regimes, whether it's Iran, Cuba, Congo, who have shut down the internet in order to repress their regime. So it's a very, the repressive regimes are learning from each other, from Belarus, from Lukashenko. Let me go to opening statements. I know, Senator, but good to have you here. I mean, in some sense, there's both what we're looking at in Belarus, Ukraine, but also disinformation is a domestic issue. Your country's just gone through the midterm elections, which was different than 2020. Just on a big picture, how powerful a threat is the disinformation threat, and some of the legislative tools that may be used to deal with it?
Well, thanks, Evan, and thank you, Svetlana, both for your courage, your leadership, and your comments. It's a reminder that there are differently configured disinformation threats. The citizens of countries like Iran or North Korea, Belarus or Russia have great difficulty accessing reliable, independent information, and the regimes there maintain their control over their populations by shutting off access to the rest of the world. We fund and support, and many in the private sector have helped develop cutting-edge tools to ensure access to reliable information for those who are living under regimes that disconnect them from the rest of the world. There's also huge challenges in open societies. There have been intentional efforts to interfere through disinformation and misinformation in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, in our recent elections. Obviously, it's had a significant impact on our response to COVID and our own domestic democratic communications. I would argue one of our great challenges legislatively in the United States Congress is both understanding and coming to grips with the impact of social media on our body politic, on our sense of ourselves, on our ability to focus. As a parent of 3 college-age, roughly, kids, I'm struck at how differently my wife and I consume social media, how our kids consume social media, how much time it takes and how it distracts. And I think there are platforms, and I'll call out TikTok right off top, that are malevolent, that are both siphoning off huge amounts of data, being used as a tool of state power, and significantly distracting. But getting my kids to stop looking at TikTok every day, every minute, is enormously challenging. It's engaging. I would even say addictive. I've got one legislative proposal around this, the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, a bipartisan bill that would, with protections, subject social media algorithms to academic study and to analysis, so we know whether or not Instagram really is demonstrably harmful to young people, so that we know whether or not state actors are able to use some of these tools to accelerate radicalization or to shape our political space. But I'll remind you, this is a problem in some ways as old as humanity. The opening clip about Pinocchio is a reminder that truth, lies, it's an old challenge. It's attributed to Mark Twain, but there's a quote that says that a lie runs halfway around the world before truth laces up its shoes. We need to invest in journalism, in free media. We need to take some of the lid off of the incredible concentration of power in social media platforms. Jigsaw has been doing some really interesting, innovative work in this space, but I think Congress in the United States has not yet done the work that the EU has in its digital services law, that other democracies have. The United States needs to show leadership on digital privacy, on protecting the rights of individuals to know and own what companies are taking from them. And we need to better resource our work in countering disinformation. Putin is increasing his investment in their platforms, RT and Sputnik and others. The Chinese are increasing their investment in their platforms. We're not doing a particularly great job of it in the United States. I don't really ever expect the State Department, that model of crisp, concise, edgy, funny communication, to be at the cutting edge of our engagement in the world. But our culture is one of our greatest sources of soft power. And if the United States better partnered between the private sector and the public sector, we could be more successful at countering disinformation.
The State Department took that as a compliment, by the way, just so you know.
I suspect I'll get a 5-page memo in my inbox 3 weeks from now expressing calm discontent.
But it's interesting, you did mention the EU Digital Services Act, and governments in Canada and the United States, all over the world, are struggling with legislative tools on this, but the big tech companies themselves, Yasmin, are very much involved. I know Jigsaw has done an enormous amount of work looking at disinformation, conspiracy theories, various other reports. Again, we'll dig into this deeper as our session goes a little deeper on how tech companies are responding outside of the legislative framework or in cooperation with it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I might just add a little bit of color to the depth of the challenge around misinformation. There's definitely disinformation, intentionally spread, false or misleading information. It's the peddlers of it or the creators of it, very upstream. You might say the platforms that facilitate it, that's also supply side. But there's a demand side challenge that's really, really thorny. And one of the things that we do in our group at Jigsaw is we do a lot of ethnographic research. So that just means that we spend a lot of time with the same human being over time, understanding how their whole life is playing out and then the role of technology within that. And we have a kind of ongoing panel of people who are conspiracy-minded and consume a lot of disinformation. And what we're seeing is that there is now this intersectionality of conspiracy belief, of disinformation purchase that intersects health misinformation, that intersects election denial in the US, that spans, 5G is a threat, and there's a whole industry around mobilizing these people in, there are conferences like the Great Reawakening, like they tour America and they convene people, religious leaders, discredited medical professionals, political pundits, and they're selling merch, t-shirts, banners, metal coins to protect you from 5G, medical cures. I mean, this is like, there is something that has taken a hold of us. And I remember when we did our first study on conspiracy theorists, I said, I'm really interested in having some people who believe in health misinfo, some people who believe like false flags, you know, like the Sandy Hook shooting didn't happen, some people who believe in the Great Replacement, which is a really motivating conspiracy theory for violent white supremacists, that there's a secret cabal that's plotting to dilute the white race and take over. Anyway, so I kind of gave the mandate, and then we got 100 people together. There wasn't a single person who only believed in one conspiracy theory. Because once you have that worldview, you know, that there's a secret cabal, there's a hidden agenda, there's a cover story, you know, and the proxies and affiliates, then you're really primed to accept a lot of narratives. In the case of the midterms, because we were tracking this panel, I got to say, election deniers really felt the efficacy of effective moderation. Not to say that it's flawless, but they were really frustrated. You know, their posts about the election being stolen or about election irregularities were being taken down. And they were so frustrated with the major platforms that they had to go elsewhere. And I think that's something that we must increasingly consider is the platforms that are private, so, you know, Telegram or private messaging apps, the platforms that are hyper-partisan, because those guys don't even, and in the US, the ones that are popular are Parler and Rumble, and they don't even have misinformation policies. I mean, the major platforms, you might criticize them for not enforcing them, you know, perfectly or consistently. Those guys, their marketing shtick is that they don't have any policies against misinformation. And of course, the ones that are you know, authoritarian owned. So I think this challenge is getting more complex, not less.
Okay, so we'll get back to that, but let's go to Yevhen. You're on the front lines at Stop Fake. Give us a sense of the kind of disinformation and the level of sophistication that the Russian disinformation before February and then as it evolves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first of all, I would like to start with the beginning of our panel when the light went off. I immediately imagined that the situation in which my colleagues are now working in Ukraine, without light, without internet, but they still continue doing the fact-checking because they understand the important role fact-checking is playing in this war and in defending Ukraine and Ukrainians at this point. And we've been looking at this problem for the last 8 years. We created the project back in 2014, immediately when the war started, because our feeling was that's the future of the war. And in order to understand the future of the war, we need to understand the informational component of it and to analyze it. So we've been working on it on a daily basis since 2014, looking into these black depths of Russian disinformation. As you might imagine, it's not the most pleasant place you want to be. But someone needs to do that, and my team was doing that work on a daily basis, as I said, and we collected a huge data set which explained how we were approaching to the February 24th. So it did not occur unexpectedly. We've been noticing the increasing amount of disinformation. We've seen the increasing volume of this disinformation, and we analyzed the main narratives which Russia were pushing, which were to justify this incursion against Ukraine. So basically, we were doing what Russians were blaming us were doing. So they're calling Stop Fake private intelligence company just because we take information from open sources. And that's exactly what we've been doing. We were taking all information or disinformation Russia was pushing, taking it from open sources, analyzing it, and making conclusions on what's going to happen next on the kinetic side of the war. Because in our case, everything which Russia was putting on disinformation side was absolutely tightly connected to what was happening on the front line. So we were absolutely capable to predict the beginning of this incursion up to the weeks. And we knew exactly what narratives Russia would be using to justify it. And it was exactly what happened. So they were saying that Ukraine is a Nazi state, Ukraine is non-existent state, Ukraine is not a real state, and that's why it should be just, should not exist anymore. And when the volume again went up, we realized that this is it. We were at the very beginning of this war. So my team continued this work without any stop, and we just continued doing what we've been doing on February 25th as well. And we again, looking at this data set we collected, we could also look at how these narratives change, and that was also very important because again it explained what Russia is going to do next militarily, politically, diplomatically, and for example, if at the beginning, as I said, they were preparing justification for this war, then they realized nobody believes it anymore. So they came to the next stage. They started to sow doubts in Ukraine, like Ukraine is selling weapons which are supplied by allies, Ukraine is a corrupt state, that's why you should not give any money to Ukraine, and others. So they're in a business of sowing doubts. And as you might imagine, there is always an audience for that. And now they are going to the next stage and trying to put all the blame for this war on Ukraine, blaming Ukraine in food crisis, energy crisis, any other things which are happening now in the world. And these narratives are heard very strongly in many places throughout the world. So my point is that you cannot fight disinformation in one place. You cannot solve this problem in Ukraine only, or you cannot solve this problem in Russia only. You should approach it internationally. You should see this as a part of the war efforts. It's not just misinformation or just another kind of truth as they want to pretend, but this is a part of the war efforts which Russia was building for years. And the biggest problem is that this infrastructure they built is still intact. It did not disappear anywhere. They are using the same platforms, they're using the same networks, influencers, and it would take quite a lot of time to stop this machine. And we can do that only, again, if we would do that internationally, holistically, working with actors in different parts of the world, including social media platforms.
Okay. Gosh, we got so many things to dig into. So hang in there. We're going to mix it up a bit. We'll get some questions, but let me go to Andrew. And I'm going to ask you to kind of pivot a little from particularly the Russia-Ukraine, although I'm sure you'll pivot back to it. But the other issue, part of our disinformation nation is about corrupting officials, stealing our stuff, kidnapping our citizens. And I want to turn to China here, obviously. The two Michael situation was an international situation. I know Vina Najmullah, who led the part of the campaign to free her husband and the other Michaels here. So this is very close. Obviously in the US, the Brittany Griner situation is a big deal. Here there's allegations of election interference in the last Canadian election. There was just recently an arrest about a Chinese official in Hydro-Quebec. To talk about how in Australia, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's meddling with elections, and whether it's the theft of intellectual property, how much of a threat has that become, and where is that heading?
Well, thanks, Evan. And the short answer is these issues are very prominent in Australia. We've had a couple of very large corporate hacks just over the last few weeks. They've been reported around the world. That's really shone a spotlight on this. And I would say the issues that we were talking about around Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine have also brought a lot of these issues right to the fore in Australia. But you know, as an intelligence professional, I guess I'd say we shouldn't be too surprised. You know, these techniques have been around as long as there's been statecraft. You know, the Cold War, Soviet active measures, political warfare, the labelling sometimes shifts, but the thinking behind it, the deep desire to reach into our societies, to shape our narratives, to steal our secrets, to sow seeds of domestic discontent and so forth is a very long story. And you know, when I think about our response to that, I think, you know, we look at what we're up against and it's incredibly daunting. But perhaps because I'm historically minded, I take some comfort from the challenges we've overcome in the past. And you know, we did rise during the Cold War to that challenge, to that contest that was thrown at us, that systemic challenge. And agencies like mine with our Five Eyes and other partners did extraordinary work all around the world in response. during the ISIL explosion, you know, we responded effectively. We developed and adapted our toolkit. We formed new partnerships outside government, across government, a much bigger span of governments, and we overcame. And then it was touched on, but I can't really be here and not give a shout out, especially to my American counterparts, Avril Haines and the entire US intelligence community, and the masterclass that they put on leading up to and following the Russian invasion, where intelligence has completely reshaped the international narrative and gave the West the strategic initiative in an incredibly powerful way against a guy who made his whole life about these techniques that we're talking about here. So, you know, there are some successes there, I think, that lead us to where the answers are. I guess what's changed, technology, bots, troll farms, etc., obvious point, but with its speed and scale, and that's something that, you know, I think we're all grappling with. And when I think about what's the intelligence component of this, you know, this is about truth and responding to these different tactics. How do we provide our traditional function in a way, which is strategic warning, it's actionable insights into intelligence, collecting information that enables us to verify what's going on and making sense of it, assessing it. None of that's changed, but we have to do it in this incredibly dynamic, ultra-fast, massive, high-volume, information volume world, and I think that's a real challenge.
Does it come with a strategic decoupling from places like China? I mean, your economy's so, how do you do that? And how do you give strategic advice on integrated economies like that? And so that information becomes practically relevant when you're trying to do business.
Data will be at the heart of this, and, you know, I'm personally proud of the role that the Five Eyes played in helping to warn of some of the perils of 5G technologies, for example. I think that's a good example of where we need to go. But it also leads you to new partnerships. You know, back in that Cold War model that I was talking about, that was essentially a government-led contest. We can't win this contest just with government. We need to partner with the platforms, with civil society in completely different ways. From an intelligence point of view, we need the technology and the tradecraft to do open source collection at a massive scale. And we also need to be exploring things like artificial intelligence that can help us get behind deep fakes and so forth. Again, going to the Senator's excellent point, you know, not 3 weeks after all the actions happened and the initiative's already been lost.
Senator, maybe just pick up on that because the Economic and Security Review Committee, I know in the States, said China as a cyber power is playing by different rules. They're a serious threat to our government. I know there's been concerns here in Canada that we don't have tough enough rules on that to protect against criminal theft and intellectual property. Just on that, the sort of under the stealing our stuff, I think in the US there's been something like 420 or something people arrested under the Criminal Trade Secrets Act, but that's not a lot since like '96. Do you need tougher laws against that kind of attack by countries like China?
Yes, it's funny you should mention that. That was literally my first major piece of legislation, was taking the antiquated and under-resourced trade secret law and strengthening it. Senator Orrin Hatch and I got that to President Obama's desk, and making it possible for there to be private rights of action for companies that know that their core trade secrets have been stolen, to be able to initiate action and not have to wait for a U.S. attorney to validate it. There were many more pressing national security and public safety crises that were taking a higher priority than defending inventions through trade secrets. So we need to continue to strengthen intellectual property protections in the United States and to work with our allies in that direction. Look, one of the greatest transfers of wealth by theft in human history has been an intentional strategy of state-sponsored theft of intellectual property from the West by the PRC. Some who know history would suggest the Americans actually did that during the colonial era and in our early development stages of industry. it may have been practiced before, but it's never been perfected at this scale, and digitally and at this speed, and with the national security consequences it has. We need to be more agile, more clear-eyed, and more engaged on protecting our inventions and innovation.
We've got about 23 minutes left. We've got 9 minutes to questions, so I'm going to mix it up if you want. We can, I don't want to fall into the pool of turgidity, which is now my new favorite word. Svetlana, I want to go to you. We're talking a bit about disinformation, but it's real. I know your husband remains in prison. We all think about that. It's very personal. There's 1,350 political prisoners in Belarus, probably more journalists. Talk about what you think, how tech companies, and Yasmin, you follow up, and governments can help combat that kind of repression, through whether it's through disinformation or literally shutting down internet, arresting journalists. What does someone like you need and to see?
You know, as for governments, we are asking to have like a two-sided approach towards Belarus, you know, to create multiple points of pressure on the regime, political pressure, economical pressure, you know, to deprive regime of resources, you know, to break corruption schemes, and on the other side, to give energy to people to resist. Because people are really getting exhausted because we are fighting with the huge propagandistic and pro-regime machine, and so help our people, help our human rights defending centers to provide lawyers to political prisoners, help our media, increase assistance to our activists, especially those who are on the ground. As for huge tech companies as Google, Meta, Twitter, I don't know, whatever, they can play a crucial role in such dictatorial regimes as in our country, because you can defend journalists and activists from KGB. You can delete the content of regime media. You know, when I'll just give you an example. When, for example, I appealing to people with some message, you know, communicating to people in very front of each YouTube video, KGB people put, like with the help of advertising, put a video of confessional video where a person who have been kidnapped, detained, he confessed the crimes he never committed. It is made to threat people, you know, to scare them. Look, everybody will be detained, you know, who will support the pro-democratic movement and so on. So you can help us to restore our content that is deleted by KGB. Again, when a person is kidnapped, the first thing KGB is doing, they check their mobiles or computers and delete Telegram channels they created or YouTube channels they created. And we need your companies, you know, to help us restore this media. As recently, one very famous Belarusian band was kidnapped. They are detained at the moment, and all the music that was inspiring thousands of people during our protests was deleted from YouTube. They deleted our history, and now we are trying to restore this content. It's very assistance of Google is very important. What's more, you know, we are struggling now for our national identity. For many, many years, you know, Lukashenko erased everything Belarusian from Belarus. Now, Belarusian books are forbidden. You can be detained if you are speaking Belarusian question. And nation is about identity. Nation is about understanding that you are, have your culture, you have your language. But Belarusian language is not supported by many Google services, and people have to switch to Russian language. So we are working on this, you know, to put Belarusian language among others. Like, for example, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, our European languages, they're rather small countries, rather small nations, but they have their languages in Google. We don't have, so we ask, you know, to continue work on this. What is important now, I'll be short, you know, it's very important to create a special group of people, 5, 10, I don't know, that will be working on Belarusian issue. They will not work ad hoc, but constantly, constant work on Belarusian content and Belarusian problems, and it will help us a lot.
I know, Yasmin, you want to pick up on it, but just interesting, we're talking a lot about the disinformation campaigns in Belarus and in Ukraine and all over the world. But on the flip side, there's a question of what the people in Belarus, the people in Russia are getting. Recently, a U.S. official said to me, I'm really disappointed that we can't seem to penetrate inside the Russian mindset. They just believe everything Putin says. Like his censorship is working. And I said, well, it's hard to penetrate in the U.S. You've got, as you've tracked, in a free media, you got 35% of people believing in conspiracy theories anyway, or more. So it's difficult in any kind of information environment right now. What's your sense of the kinds of information citizens in Belarus or Russia or China or Cuba, some repressive regimes, may be getting, and what's the role in tech in those places?
Yeah, that actually reminds me of something someone said to us. We speak to a lot of people who have left repressive regimes, and we had the opportunity to interview like a dozen people who had defected from North Korea. So they'd left via South Korea or China. And when this one woman was telling me about her fears after she had left and crossed the border, she said, we didn't just believe that the leader was omnipotent, that he was all-powerful. We believed that he was omniscient and that he would know what I was thinking. So when she left, she had the burden of thinking that she was either in danger or she was going to be somehow exposed because of her thoughts. So I mean, we have the opposite problem in the US, which is that there's too much critical thinking. Like the people on the the mantra of the conspiracy theorists is do your own research. Don't trust the person who has the credentials or the expertise or studied it at university or doctor. You should do your own research into this climate change. So yeah, it's very different dynamics. So I mean, to your question, Evan, the challenge for us in places like Russia and Belarus and Iran is exactly what Senator Kuhn said, which is give them access to the outside web. Of course, if you are only exposed to, if there's a monopoly of information and you're only exposed to one type of propaganda over time, you will internalize it. So that's the job, and we do some work in my group to offer VPNs that President Chikinskaya mentioned, which is allow people to tunnel outside of the national firewalls. And no country has yet fully perfected the idea of a national firewall. They generally do it based on blacklisting websites that they don't allow to come in. So the way that these VPNs, these virtual private networks, operate is that they are inoffensive looking. Like there'll be a server, I don't know, McDonald's.com server, and the traffic will be sent there. And then once you get outside of the country, it can send you to social media platforms or other places to get other information. The challenge is that if they become very popular, then they become anomalous to the censors, and they see them and they want to take them down. So the strategy that we have at Jigsaw is the democratization of VPNs. Allow many people to set up VPNs, civil society and others, and then it's decentralized and it's less obvious where they're showing up. I'm seeing some nodding heads, which is reassuring. And then if there might be innovation in the way that they're customized, which would also help with building resilience to censorship. The challenge, I think, with the attribute of the internet that it's allowed disinformation nations to affect audiences overseas. And then I think there's listening to Yevhen talk about being able to anticipate everything that happened. That aspect of disinformation, the recurring tropes, feels so damning. It's so demoralizing that you can see it coming, and it comes, and then it it has purchase. But really, I think that aspect of the predictability of disinformation can be its undoing. And I know the US government has some really impressive examples that maybe Senator Coons can talk about in terms of how pre-bunking, this idea of preceding the bunk, can be an incredibly powerful way of getting on the front foot, moving from defense to offense when it comes to disinformation. And we've done some work also working with civil society at Jigsaw in terms of trying to anticipate, for example, these millions of Ukrainians who've hopefully temporarily displaced people who've left the country are in these frontline nations, and it's not going to take long for the pot stirring of the Kremlin to really turn those nations against them if there is no expansion in infrastructure and support.
I know we got to get to questions. There's a lot of them. This is like a room of, in the bunker of pre-bunkers here. Okay, you got, they're hoping to pre-bunker. Yeah, you, sir. And again, we're so limited on time, and some of the panelists have had one intervention. I'd love to get more of them. But go ahead, sir, if you get to your question. That's all the time you've got. You can get the mic down, you're done.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Mauricio Mechulan from the Mexico Research Center for Peace. I just wanted to connect what you're saying to the other side of the coin, which is trust. If you take a look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, the mistrust in government and mistrust in media is huge around the world. We have conducted studies on that in Mexico as well. So how do you build trust, which would be like the structure of this issue?
So I'll go back to the point Yasmin just made and then get to you if I can on this about pre-bunking. Provide something that is true and useful. So things that are untrue, that are disinformation, often are sort of sticky. What the Russians are particularly good at is identifying and exploiting existing disconnects, places where our society is fractured. They're not just airdropping in and spreading completely wild theories. They've got a germ of truth to them. The American intelligence community did not cover itself in glory in the run-up to the Iraq War. What was critical in the weeks before the Russian invasion of Ukraine was that first privately and then publicly, we shared not small amounts, but lots of credible real-time intelligence information that our allies and frankly the rest of the world got to review, and then events proved that we were telling the truth. That's critical. First, second, I was looking at some of the data on Russian-funded disinformation in the Spanish language. RT has more Spanish language followers than CNN in Espanol. And we need to do a much better job at localization. I don't mean hire armies of US public diplomacy funded content creators. I mean helping fund the ecosystem of independent journalists and those who create valuable, timely, useful local content that also helps to push back against these disinformation narratives. If we give people usable, meaningful information in their language, in their context, that is helpful to their lives, much as we did in the intelligence context with the Ukraine war, with Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, if we're doing that in local languages by credible local providers, we can help reanimate trust between the consumers of information and sources of information.
We've got a lot of questions, so what I'm going to do is change up. I'm going to do 2 questions in a row, and then we'll I know you had a question there, and then I know Andrei Shevchenko had one. Okay, hold on. There's just a sec, Justin.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have the mic.
Okay, real quick.
Stop trying to censor me, Solomon. Just really quickly, we talk a lot about, Russia importing disinformation into North America and Europe, but we also export disinformation that gets weaponized by Moscow. I mean, the biolabs thing. I mean, Tucker Carlson was being used by Russian state TV night after night. So what do we do to disrupt those sort of, testing grounds for disinformation here? These are places, websites, Rumble, Gab, that don't want to be regulated. They don't want real journalism. They don't want to have their information pre-bunked. What do we do with them? And why are we so allergic to talking about de-radicalization in this context?
Okay, that's a great question. So we'll get to that, and someone maybe on the intelligence side. Andrei Shevchenko, you've got, and I think there's another mic. Who's got the other mic? You. Okay, let me do Andrei, and then we'll do 2 questions, and then we'll answer and then get some more.
So if we look at those classic 4 Ds of disinformation, which are dismiss, distort, distract, and dismay, we don't see much of new stuff this year. It's mostly old tricks. And Russia does not impress with what it does domestically. I think they are on defensive in terms of propaganda there. But it amazes how they keep being successful in dealing with the free world tools. When we see how Kremlin narratives travel all the way from Sputnik to the public statements of elected officials, when we see major media running headlines like 96% of Kherson voted in a referendum to join Russia, and so on. So my question is about what Yasmin just was talking about anticipating. We see the world actually going into economic slowdown. We'll see more inflation, we'll see more domestic troubles, and it's a matter of time when there'll be temptation for politicians in the free world to use this domestically, saying we've got to cut support for Ukraine and let's use that money domestically, just like we saw in the midterms. What can we do to be one step ahead of Russia, which is going to use that narrative in that context?
Okay, so let me take the first question, maybe Andrew, and then do you want to take the second question? Okay, go ahead, Andrew. On the domestic disinformation and disrupting.
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the domestic because I'm not sure whose lane it is, but it's not mine. But I will say this, you know, the intelligence role in this can be really important for getting back the strategic initiative, which I think is the power of the Ukraine example, and for getting ahead of it. And frankly, once that happened, because of the breadth and the depth and the robustness of that intelligence base, it was like a shutout, right? He never has got the strategic initiative back in that contest. To my mind, that's the value intelligence can add. But, and there is a but, that's off the back of decades of intelligence work against the former Soviet Union and Russia by the United States, the United Kingdom, the other Five Eyes. It's off the back of established, and going back to the trust word, networks for getting that intelligence out to your partners and allies. And we need to think hard about how do we learn the lessons and transfer them to other areas and other actors.
Does anyone want to just take a quick Justin's question about disinformation here, disrupting anyone before we get to this question two? Okay, so, but I think it's an excellent point as well. I know you wanted to get to the second question that Andre raised. How do you sort of pre-bunk the Russian propaganda attempt to use inflation to decouple support from Ukraine?
Yeah, probably I would even try to combine answering both questions with the same answer if possible. So my childhood went in Soviet Union, and we had 3 TV channels, 2 of which were showing the same content. So you might want to switch between there, you know, but you would get the same content over there. But what was there was an appetite to get another type of information, or real information, not the propaganda Soviet television was feeding to you. And now I think the whole system flipped, and we see the opposite picture. We do not see the appetite for truth in the audiences. They have plenty of information around, but they never want to go beyond some patterns they already developed. They don't want to go beyond the bubble they created or someone created around them, and they don't want to look outside because, for example, what we fact checkers are doing can be done by ordinary people mostly. Sometimes it's very easy. You just go to Google, you ask the right question, you know, and you immediately get the answer. So the distance between disinformation and truth is just one click, but nobody wants to take that far away, you know, step. And that explains why disinformation is actually winning globally, because people don't want to take this small step because they're very comfortable in what they already have. And they also don't want to look beyond that. That's one of the reasons. The second reason is unwillingness to accept the destructive role of disinformation, because Stop Fake and many other fact checkers around the world were talking about this danger for 8 years at least. And nobody was paying attention to this danger, saying that's all about freedom of speech. And finally, everybody realized that it's not about freedom of speech, because disinformation is ruining freedom of speech, is occupying the space, which is usually occupied by real journalism, real information. And when incursion started, sometimes it was too late already to get into the game, and I'm grateful to social media platforms like Jigsaw, who contacted us immediately and said, what we can do for you to help improve the situation, or Meta, who've been working with us for 2 years. But some platforms, as Yasmin said, were just unregulated field where you don't have any rules and you don't have any a way to enforce those rules, like Telegram, which is considered globally as a neutral platform, despite of the fact that it's a Russian-organized, Russian-run, where Russian is harvesting all the data from users and other things. So that's another problem. And finally, yes, I totally agree with Andriy that Russia would be trying to weaponize those doubts again, because for the same reason, as I said, the whole infrastructure they created is still intact, especially if we would go to the global south. There is a huge audience over there to what Russia is producing. And for example, now we have stopped faking Spanish to reach out to South America. We have stopped faking French to reach out to African countries. And there is a huge evidences how proactive Russia is over there, with physical presence on the ground, with social media content, with local influencers, with local educational institutions working over there. That's how they are winning. And if we might say that, yes, we are winning information war, for example, in European countries, United States, Canada, and when I'm saying we, I'm not meaning only Ukraine, because we are fighting for the same truth, you know. But in the rest of the world, the situation is not that kind of clear-cut, and the trust to everything Russia produces is still very high. Because if you would compare in Ukraine, nobody already trusts whatever which is connected to Russia. So it's coming from Russian media or Russian government or Russian influencers. They don't have any impact anymore. But if you would go beyond Ukraine and you would go to other places, and for example, what Twitter did, they limited the presence of Russian propagandistic media, but only in the countries where they are sanctioned, in the EU, United States, Canada, Australia, but in the rest of the world, they are fully available, they work in a food force, and again, they produce a lot of content in local languages. That's how they try to use to local audiences, by domesticating propaganda and localizing their messages, trying to find differences in societies, and just making those cracks bigger. That's how they've been working for years, and they continue doing that.
We literally have a minute left, and I know we have many, many questions. And it's a sign that the disinformation issue, the rogue regime issue on anything from intellectual property is resonant. And I'm going to leave the last 30 seconds to Svetlana, and if you have questions, I'm sure the panelists will be happy to answer them after. Because we're all watching the war in Ukraine, tragically, but long before that started, long after, the disinformation war is continuing, and it's affecting any country here, and it sows the field, sadly, for conflicts in the future. Just because you're on the front lines of this in your country, is there one message that you have here as, from the outside, you are fighting essentially a disinformation war right now about your own country to have fair elections? Is there one last thing in the last 45 seconds we've got here that you could say to this group that you would need to penetrate back into your country some kind of legitimate process where elections like the one you ran in may function? I know that was long. She told me to speak slower last. One last word to the audience about what you think that you know. She said, Evan, speak more slowly when you're asking me a question. And
You have a difficult accent. So thank you for this opportunity, to speak in front of you, because I see that Belarus is a little bit overlooked behind the war in Ukraine. Again, we are fully supporting Ukrainians in this dreadful war with Russia. But I have to remind you that Belarusian regime, Lukashenko's regime, is also a participant in this war, and don't overlook his participation in the war. And when you in information in media mention the war, always put Putin or Russia and Belarusian regime, not Belarus. We don't want our country to be perceived as collaborant or co-aggressor. Just distinguish between Belarusian regime and Belarusian people, because 86% of Belarusians are against participation of Belarus in this war, and we're supporting Ukrainians as much as we can. But people in Belarus are a little bit offended when they see Russia and Belarus are aggressors. Thank you.
Okay. And that's relevant from a military point of view as well, if they tried to open up. All right, I want to thank this panel, all of you. That was fantastic. We had obviously more than we could get to. Please give them a hand, and thank you very much.